Greetings to baristas. As you might be aware, the current torture scandal of and by the Syrian state apparatus of Bashar al-Assad has been righteously seized upon by the perpetrators of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib as proof of the need for regime change in said nation. Of course, there is contemptible hypocrisy shown here by the U.S., specifically from its Secretary of State, the anti-war protester turned international vigilante John Kerry, who positioned himself and the U.S. as dictator of any conference by imposing terms and conditions designed to sabotage any meaningful dialogue. But, aside from the predictable amnesia for the United States' own crimes, there is indeed gruesome and damning evidence forthcoming from always clandestine sources regarding the systematic human destruction of government opponents. Although one must always be skeptical of such unnamed sources, especially in the light of the smoking anuses of the Iraq fiasco, there is a smoking gun in the 55,000 photographs and videos brought out of Syria, 27,000 of which have been released for elite review. These depict the most gruesome tortures imaginable, described by those who have seen them as looking like a slaughterhouse or as an industrial mass-age killing, systematic, ordered, and directed from above. It's estimated that the total to date hovers around 80,000 victims. There's no reason to doubt such descriptions or such statistics, just as there's no reason to doubt the opposition's many factions have indulged a similar, if less sweeping, taste for blood violence. There are, however, as any honest person acknowledges, certain problems with the drumbeat of human rights outrage being orchestrated by Western powers. Since they were stymied by public distaste for a new war of humanitarian imperialism, the tack now is to amass evidence designed to sabotage any negotiation with the Syrian rulers, to justify assistance to the opposition, and to prove the unconditional necessity to haul Assad before a tribunal and a hangman, no questions asked. Sir Edmund de Silva, the UN's chief prosecutor in Sierra Leone, openly gave the game away when he stated that all we can do is put the ammunition in the pistol, it is for others to aim and pull the trigger. The analogy is not just Freudian, it's a dead giveaway of strategic trajectory. Another problem is that the leading Western human rights watchdogs, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, were not contacted as in past cases. One must ask, why not, since these organizations have proven such reliable tools of Western imperial policy? Instead, the allegations were leaked directly to the mainstream Western media via the Western Gulf state partner Qatar, to reliable pro-intervention outlets such as The Guardian or Christiane Amanpour of CNN. This strategy obviously seeks direct engagement with the Western political class, rather than the civil society NGO cutouts of previous campaigns. This is another giveaway of orchestration by pro-intervention Western governments using more classic tried-and-true propaganda methods. A third problem is that the Syrian security and military apparatus has been engaging in such gruesome pastimes for a half-century. In 1982, similar methods were used in suppressing and punishing the Islamist-led uprising in Hama. Ne'er a peep was heard from the West at the time. There was no talk of arming Syrian rebels then, because the Islamist victims were not, just like the Kurds of Turkey, the kind to draw Western sympathy. And the world of 1982 was not unipolar. There was another great power on the planet, with military ties to the state of Assad Sr. So destabilizing it with a proxy civil war would have upset not only the regional balance of power, but the global one too. On the record, the kinds of torture chamber atrocities practiced by Syria were then reported by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch under Senior's regime. Human Rights Watch released this special report on Syria 23 years ago. Reviewing the techniques employed then already give a sufficient idea of what the recent photographs purport to show. These practices included al-Farouj, the chicken, where the victim is tied to a roasting spit and rotated while receiving multiple beatings over his entire body. Then there was the al-Abd al-Aswad, the black slave, where the victim is strapped to a heated metal skewer which is to be driven up the anus. Then there was the al-Ghasala, the washing machine, where the victim's arms are inserted into a spinning drum, catching and crushing and mangling fingers, hands, and arms alike. There was the al-Kursi al-Almani, the German chair, enough to choke you up, a metal chair with hinges on the back. The victim is strapped in and part of the chair is tilted backward to torture the spine, neck, and legs. One variant related to me by a Syrian exile involves stretching the victim onto a flexible metal cross that could be twisted into torturing shapes. Another has knives inserted, cutting the victim's flesh as the chair or cross is rotated or flexed. So we see that widespread, systematic, and atrocious forms of torture are not new under the Syrian sun, even if recently discovered by Western news agencies. calling these Nazi methods are not off the mark. It's well known that refugee Gestapo and SS men fled to the Middle East and found work as advisors to newly emerging regional regimes. Their expertise in the torture chambers of the Third Reich within Germany and its occupied territories, a familiar term, were eagerly sought by the rising phalange of generals, supreme leaders, shahs, and sheiks. Amnesty International described the Syrian security police, the Mukhabarat, called the same in Saddam's Iraq, as dedicated to devising new and insidiously creative torture techniques, and its centers as laboratories of torture. So, what's the point? Doesn't that mean Assad Jr. is indeed a son of a bitch, and deserves to go by any means necessary? But here's the problem with the West dog and pony morality play. Judge Judy Justice states, as maximum number 1, you can't come to court unless you have clean hands. You have no legal or ethical credibility to press charges on another person's violation of law if you were guilty of the same thing, or if you've aided and abetted the same kind of crime, or have not taken the kind of punitive action against other parallel offenders known to you that you are now demanding. A good case in point is provided in the Western Hemisphere of a generation ago, specifically the southern cone states of South America. Under U.S. leadership, their security services combined together in a cross-action program called Operation Condor. This was established by CIA coordination with the states of Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and of course Chile. Again, enough to choke you up. There was no possible defense of democracy involved here. These were all hardcore military regimes, self-professed national security states. No conceivably sovereign democratic government could either have consented to such an open-ended operation or condoned the outside coordination that made it possible. Like Syria, the southern cone states of Latin America were up against armed insurgencies. Some of these were largely imaginary, as in Chile. Others were riddled with provocateurs, like the Montoneros of Argentina. Others were genuine, such as the Tupamaros of Uruguay and other guerrilla fronts in Brazil and Bolivia, the latter where Che Guevara met his end. There was no need for unnamed, unclassified sources to prove the genocidal violence unleashed by Condor. As with the documentation maintained in Syria, the death squad states of South America maintained a copious archive in Asuncion, Paraguay, called the Terror Archives, of 60,000 documents, 593 microfilmed pages weighing, count them, Tubaneros, 4 tons of torture, execution, and manufactured disappearances. The estimated total is, again, 80,000 lost souls, the same number as in the Syrian counterinsurgency. Not only did these torturers and executioners receive expertise from U.S. counterinsurgency trainers, the Chilean commander-in-chief of Condor was a longtime CIA asset, but their original mentors in torture had come from that other stream of Gestapo agents and SS men that fled to South America, whose camaraderie had helped Syria, Iraq, and Egypt set up their state security machines. Small world, huh? Did Western leaders feel the same kind of outrage over massive human rights violations by these governments against their own people in the name of fighting armed insurgents? Well, in 1976, then U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the Jewish-American refugee from Nazi-occupied Austria and defender of Israel, went on record with Argentina's overtly anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi foreign minister in the midst of that country's dirty war, stating, "Look, our basic attitude is that we would like you to succeed. I have an old-fashioned view that friends ought to be supported. What is not understood in the United States is that you have a civil war. We read about human rights problems, but not the context. The quicker you succeed, the better. The human rights problem is a growing one. Your ambassador can apprise you. We want a stable situation. We won't cause you unnecessary difficulties. If you can finish before Congress gets back, the better. Whatever freedoms you could restore would help. In other words, bleed the red out of these countries, destroy their civil societies by liquidating organized labor leaders, the clergy, students and their professors, the private professions, journalists and reporters, then declared the corpses liberated. Whoops! Had to make those disappear too in mass unmarked graves. Just imagine the moral outrage the New York Times would shit all over its pages if Vladimir Putin were saying this in a meeting with Syria's foreign minister. Talk about an ass rag. But, to be fair, there was indeed outrage in the West and the U.S. over these grisly doings, which is why Kissinger's semi-embarrassed advice to the Argentines to get their shit in order before the do-gooders in government, law, and the media tied his helping hands. But in all the Western outrage, was there any government-sponsored movement to disinvest in South America, to boycott its products or repressive regimes? Any serious talk of disrupting diplomatic relations? Any mention of aiding insurgent forces in their armed struggle for regime change and human rights? Of fucking course not. Such a notion is completely preposterous, because the death squad torturers of South America were on the right side of history, tuberistas. That is, of protecting Western interests. The helping hand of Henry Kissinger and his kind in Washington ensured that Western outrage would stay moral, not practical. In the 1980s, this same genocidal counterinsurgency reappeared in Central America. Once again, the U.S. came down on the side of the torturers and executioners, subsidizing them at your tax-paying expense. In El Salvador alone, a country the size and population of a single Syrian province, there were again 80,000 dead by torture, execution, and disappearance. There was, however, one original twist. When one of the terror and torture regimes, Nicaragua, succumbed to insurgents, the U.S. had to create a counterinsurgent insurgency, a Latin equivalent of Al-Qaeda that the President of the United States called the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. I thought it was about time. Hello? Why, it's former President Ronald Reagan. Where are you these days? What? You don't remember? Well, anyway. You agree with Henry that friends ought to be supported, even if they're outright sons of bitching bad guys? Oh, they become good guys just because they're your friends. Well, show me who your friends are. Do I need to finish the rest? But at least Kissinger, as loathsome as he was honest. When he says human rights are bullshit for sissies who finish last in the real world, he is what he is. People like you and Senator John McCain are nothing but hypocrites. You support death squad terror states when it suits you, then switch back and support terrorist insurgents when that is convenient. But even you are still not as despicable as liberals like Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, the types that can justify mass death by bomber wing or on-the-ground proxies in the name of human rights. Really, Ronnie, the only moral course open to you and the republic for which you stand is to back off Assad, just like Kissinger backed off from Pinochet. And you backed off from Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. Let the people of Syria deal with it. Let them resolve their problems with their own government, on their own. Well, Assad may not have any right to kill his own people, like they're his to own, but people like you have even less right to kill them, because they're not yours either.